She was 8 months pregnant when she found the hotel receipt in his pocket. $642. Room service
What is
for
this?
two.
$3,000 at
On the
D'Angelo's
same night, he
Steakhouse.
told her he was in Chicago.
Celeste, just calm down. Is she
But that was
considered
not the worst
business now?
part. The worst
The
part was when his
celebration is
mother
in
walked
order,
through the
don't you
door,
think?
carrying
Here are
champagne,
the papers we
already
discussed.
celebrating. They
How could
handed
you
her
do this
divorce
to me?
papers, already drafted. Her name already typed in the signature lines. They called her baby a situation. They gave her $30,000 to disappear, and she signed every single page. What they did not know, what nobody knew, was that the quiet wife they were throwing away like garbage was the only daughter of a tech trillionaire. She had hidden her identity for 5 years. She wanted to be loved for herself, not for her family's money. Now she had her answer. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. 12 minutes after she signed those papers, her father walked through that door. And the man who thought he was discarding a nobody was about to discover he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What happens next will remind you that the people who need you to be less than you are will never be satisfied. And sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply becoming the person you were always meant to be. Value statement. This story carries a powerful message for anyone who has ever felt not enough. It reminds us that hiding who we are to earn someone's love will never work. Because the right people will love you for your truth, and the wrong people will leave no matter how small you make yourself. Meaning of the story. This is not just a story about betrayal and revenge. It is a story about reclaiming your identity, about learning that your worth is not determined by how others treat you, and about finding the courage to rise after you have been knocked down. If you have ever loved someone who made you feel invisible, this story is for you. The hotel receipt floated from his jacket pocket like a confession. Celeste caught it midair without thinking. Just a reflex, the way she always caught things that fell from Garrett's pockets when she did the laundry. Gum wrappers, business cards, the occasional crumpled dollar bill. But this was different. The Peninsula, $642. Room service for two. She read it once, then again, then one more time, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The date was wrong. That was the problem. The date said he was in Boston on November 3rd, but November 3rd was the night he called her from Chicago. She remembered because she had been craving Thai food, and he had talked her through ordering delivery while she sat alone in their modest apartment, 8 months pregnant and too exhausted to leave the couch. He had described his hotel room in Chicago. The view of the river, the terrible coffee from the lobby. He had not mentioned the Peninsula in Boston. He had not mentioned room service for two. Outside their bedroom window, a siren wailed past. The sound faded into the distance. The afternoon light slanted through the blinds in golden stripes. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, but nothing was the same. Celeste pressed her hand against her belly. The baby kicked, a hard, insistent kick, right against her palm, as if her daughter already knew something was wrong. She checked the date again. November 3rd, room service for two. $642. The front door opened. Garrett walked in with his leather briefcase, and his confident stride. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His charcoal suit was perfectly pressed. He looked like what he was, a successful corporate lawyer, a man going places. He smiled when he saw her. That familiar smile, the one that had made her heart flutter in a coffee shop 3 years ago. She held up the receipt. The smile disappeared. His face shifted through 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise first, then calculation, then irritation, and finally, something that looked almost like relief, like a man who had been waiting for a confrontation and was glad it had finally arrived. She said nothing, she just waited. 30 years old and 8 months pregnant, standing in their bedroom with a hotel receipt in her hand, waiting for her husband to explain why room service for two did not include her. Garrett set down his briefcase. He loosened his tie. He said, "You went through my things. Not denial, not explanation, deflection." Celeste felt something cold move through her chest. It was not surprise. That would come later. Right now it was something else. Recognition, maybe. The feeling of a puzzle piece sliding into place. She said, "You told me you were in Chicago." He said, "This is not how I wanted to have this conversation." She said, "What conversation?" It was not a question. Her voice was flat. She noticed that her hands were not shaking. Strange, she always thought her hands would shake at a moment like this. Garrett walked past her to the closet. He began removing his jacket, hanging it up with precise movements, as if they were discussing dinner plans. He said, "We should sit down." She said, "I am pregnant, Garrett. I have been sitting down for the past 3 hours. Tell me what this is." He turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw it. The thing she had been refusing to see for months, maybe longer. The coldness beneath the charm, the calculation beneath the warmth. He said, "You think I wanted this?" She waited. He said, "Look at yourself, Celeste. Look at what you have become. You are supposed to be my partner, not my dependent." The words landed like blows, each one precise, each one designed to hurt. She said, "I am carrying your child." He said, "And you have made that your entire identity. When is the last time you contributed anything? When is the last time you were interesting? You used to have thoughts, Celeste. Opinions. Now all you do is nest and nap and complain about being tired." She stared at him. This man she had loved for 3 years. This man she had married in a small ceremony with wildflowers because he said he did not need anything fancy. This man who had told her, again and again, that she was enough. She said, "Who is she?" He did not answer immediately. He finished hanging up his jacket. He adjusted the collar. He turned back to her with that same expression, relief mixed with irritation. He said, "Her name is Blythe, and I am not going to apologize for finding someone who actually sees me." Celeste felt the baby kick again, harder this time. She pressed her hand against her belly and took a breath. She said, "How long?" He said, "Does it matter?" She said, "Yes." He shrugged. The gesture was so casual, so dismissive, as if they were discussing a restaurant he had tried without telling her. He said, 8 months, maybe 9. 8 months. Their marriage was barely 3 years old. He had started sleeping with someone else 8 months in. She had been pregnant for 7 of those months, growing his child inside her body while he grew something else entirely. She walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The city lights were beginning to blink on below. The sky was turning purple at the edges. Somewhere out there, people were going about their normal lives, coming home from work, making dinner, having conversations that did not end worlds. The baby kicked again, softer now, almost a flutter. Celeste closed her eyes. She thought about the life she had built here, the small apartment that was supposed to be temporary, the teaching position she had taken because she wanted to earn her own way. The 5 years of loving this man, 5 years of hiding who she really was because she wanted to be loved for herself. All of it was a lie. Behind her, she heard Garrett moving around the bedroom, opening drawers, closing them, his movements brisk and businesslike. She said, without turning around, "What happens now?" He said, "Now we handle this like adults." She turned to face him, and that was when his mother walked through the door, carrying champagne. Dorothea Hollis swept into the room with the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. She was 62 years old and looked 50. Her silver hair was immaculately styled. Her cashmere coat probably cost more than Celeste's entire wardrobe. She was not surprised to see them fighting. She was prepared. Dorothea set the champagne on the dresser. 2 bottles, expensive labels. She looked at Celeste with an expression of practiced sympathy, the kind of sympathy that was really satisfaction wearing a mask. She said, "Oh dear. Did Garrett finally tell you? I have been saying for months. This marriage was a mistake from the beginning." Celeste stared at her mother-in-law, the woman who had smiled at her wedding, who had given a toast about welcoming her to the family, who had called her daughter during the first year and occasionally invited her to lunch. All of it rehearsed, all of it performance, all of it waiting for this moment. Garrett cleared his throat. He said, "Mother, I was going to handle this privately." Dorothea waved her hand. The gesture was dismissive, imperial. She said, "Nonsense. This concerns the family. I should be here." Celeste felt the cold spreading through her chest. It was reaching her fingertips now, making everything feel numb and distant. She said, "You knew about the affair." Dorothea smiled. It was not a kind smile. She said, "Sweetheart, I introduced them." The words hung in the air. Celeste processed them slowly. Dorothea had introduced Garrett to his mistress. His mother had arranged for him to cheat on his pregnant wife. She looked at Garrett, waiting for him to deny it, to show some flicker of shame or regret. He just straightened his tie and reached for his briefcase. He said, "This is not how I wanted you to find out. But since we are here, let us be practical about this." He pulled out a manila envelope, thick, official-looking. He set it on the bed between them. He said, "I have already had the papers drawn up. You will find the terms are more than fair." Celeste did not move. She did not reach for the envelope. She just stared at it, a manila envelope containing the end of her marriage, already prepared, already waiting. Her voice came out steady, steadier than she expected. She said, "How long have you been planning this?" Garrett glanced at his mother. Something passed between them, some silent communication that Celeste was not meant to see. He said, "The timing is unfortunate, but with the baby coming, it seemed better to handle this now rather than drag it out." Dorothea nodded. She picked up one of the champagne bottles and began examining the label. She said, "Think of it as a kindness, dear. You can focus on the baby without the distraction of a failing marriage." Celeste looked at the envelope on the bed. She looked at her husband. She looked at her mother-in-law with her champagne and her satisfied smile, and she understood. This was not a conversation. This was not a negotiation. This was an ambush. They had planned this together. They had prepared for this moment. They had coordinated their attack with the precision of a military operation, and they expected her to crumble. Garrett picked up the envelope and opened it. He pulled out the papers inside. Divorce papers. Her name was already typed in the signature lines. The terms were already spelled out. She got the apartment. $30,000 for what he called the baby situation. The baby situation. Her daughter, their daughter. Reduced to a situation, a problem to be solved with a check. Dorothea walked over and held out a pen. She said, "Sign now, dear. Dragging this out helps no one. Think of the stress on the baby." Celeste looked at the pen. She looked at the papers. She looked at the 2 people who had decided her marriage was over without consulting her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without thinking. A text from a number she had not used in 3 years. A number she had deliberately stopped calling because she wanted to prove she could build a life without it. The message was simple. "I know what is happening. I am 12 minutes away. Do not sign anything." Her father. Somehow Harrison Mercer knew. Celeste stared at the message. Her thumb hovered over the delete button. She thought about what would happen if she let him come. The lawyers that would fill this room, the resources that would suddenly become visible, the truth that she had hidden for 5 years. She thought about Garrett's face when he realized who she really was. And then she deleted the message, because if there was one thing she refused to do, it was prove him right about who she really was. She looked up at Dorothea, at the pen in her outstretched hand, at the papers that would end her marriage. And she thought, not like this, not because of the money. If this marriage ends, it ends because it deserves to end, not because of who my father is. She said, "Give me the pen." The pen felt heavier than it should have. Celeste sat on the edge of the bed with the divorce papers spread before her. 12 pages, each one typed with precise legal language, each one designed to dissolve 5 years of her life into clean, manageable paragraphs. Dorothea hovered nearby. Her champagne sat unopened on the dresser, waiting for the celebration to begin. Garrett stood by the window, with his arms crossed. His posture said impatience. His expression said victory. Celeste turned to the first page and began to read. Dorothea said, "You do not need to read every word, dear. Garrett had his best people draft these. Everything is perfectly standard." Celeste did not look up. She said, "I will read every word." She read slowly, deliberately, taking her time with each clause and subsection, not because she did not understand the legal language. She understood it perfectly well. Her father's lawyers had taught her to read contracts before she was 18. No, she read slowly because she wanted them to wait. She wanted them to stand there in their certainty while she made them witness every moment of what they were doing to her. The terms were not generous. That was the first thing she noticed. Garrett had called them more than fair. They were not. She got the apartment, but the apartment was rented, not owned. She got $30,000. But $30,000 would last perhaps a year with a newborn. She got nothing from his retirement accounts, nothing from his investments, nothing from the partnership track at his firm that she had helped him pursue by handling everything at home. While he worked 80-hour weeks, she was being discarded, efficiently and completely. She said without looking up, "This gives you full custody." Garrett shifted his weight. He said, "Shared custody. You have the baby primarily. I have visitation rights." She read the clause again. He was right about the words, but the words were structured in a way that gave him power. He could petition for changes at any time. He could challenge her parenting decisions. He could use their daughter as leverage for years to come. His best people had drafted this. They had drafted it very carefully. She thought about her father's message. "I know what is happening, 12 minutes away." Those 12 minutes had passed by now. He was probably outside, waiting, wondering why she had not responded. She could call him right now. One phone call and this room would fill with lawyers who cost more per hour than Garrett made in a week. One sentence and he would realize he was not divorcing a teaching assistant who had brought nothing to their marriage. He was divorcing someone who could buy his firm and everyone in it. But proving him wrong would prove her fear right. The fear that had haunted her since she was old enough to understand what her last name meant. That no one could love her without the money. She wanted to be chosen. Just once. She wanted to be enough. She turned to the second page. Dorothea sighed. The sound was theatrical, designed to communicate how unreasonable Celeste was being. She said, "Really, dear, you are making this harder than it needs to be. Garrett is trying to be civilized about this." Celeste looked up. She met her mother-in-law's eyes. She said, "Civilized. You introduced your son to his mistress while I was pregnant. You planned this together. You walked in here with champagne." Dorothea did not flinch. If anything, her smile widened. She said, "Bless your heart, sweetheart. I was trying to help my son find happiness. You cannot blame a mother for wanting that." Celeste held her gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the papers. She kept reading. Page 3, page 4, page 5. The financial terms were hidden throughout, buried in subclauses and addendums. If she signed without reading, she would give up rights she did not even know she had. Garrett's best people had done their work well. She thought about the first time she met him, a coffee shop in Cambridge 3 years ago. She had been wearing an oversized sweater and grading papers for the undergraduate philosophy course she was teaching as a graduate assistant. He had approached her table with that smile of his, that confident, charming smile. He had said, "You are reading Dostoevsky in a Starbucks. That is either very pretentious or very brave." She had laughed. She had not laughed in weeks at that point. Her father had been pressuring her to come home, to take her place at Mercer Technologies, to stop pretending she could have a normal life. Garrett had seemed like an escape, a man who did not know her last name, who did not care about her family's money, who asked her what she thought about suffering and redemption instead of what she did for a living. Had it ever been real? Even that first conversation. She turned to page 6. Her hands were still steady, her eyes were dry, her voice, when she spoke, was calm. She said, "There's a clause here about intellectual property." Garrett said, "Standard boilerplate." She said, "It says any creative work I produce during the marriage belongs to the marital estate, and since you are the primary earner, it defaults to you." Garrett shrugged. He said, "You have not produced any creative work." She said, "I have been writing a novel for 2 years. You know that." His expression flickered, annoyance maybe, or impatience. He said, "A novel you have not finished. A novel you will probably never finish. Can we please move this along?" Celeste looked at him, really looked at him. She tried to find the man she had married in that face, the man who had held her hand during thunderstorms because he knew she was afraid of them, the man who had made her breakfast in bed on her birthday and sung to her off-key. That man was gone, or maybe that man had never existed. She turned to page 7. Dorothea made another sound of impatience. She walked over to the dresser and began opening the champagne. The cork popped. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. She said, "I cannot wait any longer. Garrett, surely this is taking too long." Assad. Garrett checked his watch, his expensive watch, the one Celeste had given him for their first anniversary because he had admired it in a store window. He said, "I have dinner reservations at 8. Celeste did not ask who the reservations were with. She did not need to. She kept reading. Page 8, page 9, page 10. The baby shifted inside her, a slow roll, her daughter repositioning herself, getting comfortable in the only home she had ever known. Celeste pressed her hand against her belly. She felt the outline of a tiny foot, or maybe an elbow, something small and sharp and alive. She thought, "I will protect you. Whatever else happens, I will protect you." Page 11, page 12. She reached the signature page. Her name was typed beneath a blank line. Celeste Ann Mercer Hollis. The hyphen she had added when they married. The name she had built for herself. She looked at the pen in her hand. She thought about everything she was giving up, not the money. She had never cared about the money. But the dream of being loved for herself, the dream of building something real with someone who saw her clearly. That dream was dying, right here, in this room, with champagne being poured and a clock being watched. She signed. Her signature looked the same as always. Strange how you expect your handwriting to change when your life is ending. But the loops and lines were identical to 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards and anniversary notes. Page 1, page 2, page 3. She signed them all. Garrett took the papers as soon as she finished. He did not look at her. He just checked each signature, making sure they were in the right places, making sure everything was legally binding. Dorothea handed him a glass of champagne. She raised her own. She said, "To new beginnings." They clinked glasses. Celeste stood up. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water she knew she would not drink, turned on the faucet, and watched it drip, 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 drip. Behind her, she could hear them talking. Low voices, pleased voices, the sound of victory being savored. She stared at the faucet, counted the drips. Let her mind go somewhere else, somewhere quiet and far away. The doorbell rang. She heard Garrett's footsteps crossing the living room, heard the door open, heard his voice change. She turned around, and she saw his face go white. Harrison Mercer stood in the doorway like a man who had walked there from another world. He was 67 years old, silver hair, quiet eyes, impeccably dressed in a way that was not ostentatious, but unmistakably expensive. Behind him stood two other men. One was Teddy Vance, the family attorney, who had handled Mercer legal affairs for 30 years. The other was Marcus Webb, whose official title was head of security, but whose actual job was making problems disappear. Garrett did not recognize Harrison immediately. Why would he? Harrison Mercer famously never appeared in public. His photographs were 30 years old. He had built one of the largest technology companies in human history while remaining almost completely invisible. Garrett said, "Can I help you?" His voice was polite but confused. The voice of a man interrupted during a private celebration by strangers who had somehow found his apartment. Harrison looked past him. His eyes found Celeste, standing by the kitchen sink, found her tear-streaked face, found the stack of signed papers on the coffee table. He said, "I am here for my daughter." The champagne glass slipped from Dorothea's hand, crystal shattering against hardwood, 1,000 glittering pieces scattering across the floor. Garrett said, "I'm sorry. You're what?" Harrison stepped into the apartment without being invited. Teddy and Marcus followed. The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. Harrison said, "Celeste is my only child. The teaching assistant job was real. She wanted to earn her own way. The small apartment was her choice. She wanted to live like anyone else." He paused. His voice remained steady. "But make no mistake. She is the sole heir to Mercer Technologies. The trillionaire's daughter you have been treating like a burden. That is my girl." Celeste watched Garrett's face. She watched the confusion dissolve, watched understanding dawn, watched horror flash through his eyes as he calculated everything he had done and everything it meant. And then she watched something else, something she had been expecting but hoping she would not see. Calculation. His face shifted again. The shock faded. The wheels began turning. She could almost see him reassessing the situation, looking for angles, looking for leverage, looking for a way to turn this revelation to his advantage. He reached for her. His voice softened. His expression rearranged itself into something that looked almost like tenderness. He said, "Celeste, sweetheart, let us talk about this. Obviously, there has been a misunderstanding. I did not know. If I had known who you really were—" She said, "You called our daughter a situation. 7 minutes ago. The papers are signed. You got what you wanted." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry. Something had shifted inside her when she saw that calculation on his face. The last ember of hope for their marriage had finally gone dark. Dorothea was trying to recover. She had bent down to pick up the broken glass, then remembered that women like her did not pick up broken glass. She straightened. She smoothed her cashmere coat. She tried to regain her composure. She said, "This does not change what she is. A liar. She lied to my son about who she was for years." Harrison turned to look at her. Just looked. His expression did not change. But something in his stillness made Dorothea take a step back. He said, "My daughter chose to find out if someone could love her without knowing about her inheritance. Your son answered that question quite clearly." Marcus Webb moved to the coffee table. He picked up the signed divorce papers and handed them to Teddy Vance. Teddy began examining them with a small frown. Garrett said, "Those are legally binding. She signed them willingly. Whatever you think you are going to accomplish here," Teddy said, without looking up, "these papers contain at least 7 clauses that violate Massachusetts law. The financial terms are so aggressively one-sided that any family court in the state would void them on principle." He looked at Garrett over his reading glasses. "Your firm drafted these." Garrett's jaw tightened. He said, "They were reviewed by qualified attorneys." Teddy said, "Qualified to lose their licenses, perhaps." Harrison walked past all of them. He walked to where Celeste stood by the kitchen sink. He reached out and took her hand. This was strange. Her father was not a demonstrative man. He had never been comfortable with physical affection. But he held her hand now the way he used to when she was a little girl and scared of the dark. He said, quietly, "I should have interfered sooner. I thought I was respecting your choices." She said, "You were. I chose wrong, but I chose." He nodded. He understood. That was the thing about her father. He had always understood the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. She thought about the last 3 years, all the time she had wanted to call him, all the time she had almost told Garrett the truth, all the time she had stopped herself because she was afraid he would stay for the wrong reasons, afraid he would leave for the wrong reasons, afraid she would never know if any of it was real. Now she knew. None of it was real, and the knowing hurt more than she had expected. Garrett was talking again. His voice had shifted into lawyer mode, confident, aggressive, looking for leverage. He said, "Even if those papers are voided, she cannot claim anything from my assets. We signed a prenuptial agreement. It clearly states that any property acquired before or during the marriage remains separate." Teddy did not seem impressed. He said, "You mean the prenuptial agreement that your attorney slipped into the wedding documents? The one your wife signed, thinking it was standard paperwork?" Garrett's face flickered. He said, "She signed it. That is all that matters." Teddy said, "That prenuptial agreement has more problems than I can count. Hidden clauses, buried provisions, language designed to confuse rather than clarify." He set the divorce papers aside. "In my professional opinion, it would not survive a single day of discovery." Garrett looked at Celeste. His expression had changed again, anger now. The real him showing through. He said, "You played me. This whole marriage was a game to you." Celeste met his eyes. She thought about all the dinners she had cooked for him, all the nights she had waited up until he came home from work, all the times she had rubbed his feet after a hard day because he said it helped him relax. She said, "I made you dinner when you were studying for the bar. I rubbed your feet when you lost your first case. I held your hand when your father died." Her voice did not waver. "None of that had anything to do with money, but you will never understand that." Dorothea stepped forward. Her composure was cracking. Her voice had taken on an edge of desperation. She said, "She cannot prove anything. She cannot prove she was not trying to trap my son. She cannot prove she did not plan this from the beginning." Marcus Webb spoke for the first time. His voice was matter-of-fact, almost bored. He said, "Actually, she does not have to prove anything. I have been documenting your son's activities for 3 years." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Thick, detailed, full of photographs and bank statements and transcribed conversations. He said, "The affair with Blythe Ashford started 8 months into the marriage. Your son used a private credit card to pay for hotel rooms, gifts, and trips. He hid the card from his wife, but not from his accountant, who was very cooperative once he understood the situation." He pulled out more documents. He said, "The planning for this divorce began 14 months ago. There are emails between your son and his mother discussing timeline and strategy. One message specifically recommends waiting until Mrs. Hollis was further along in her pregnancy because, and I quote, once she is further along, she will be too tired to fight." He kept going. He said, "Your son has been systematically isolating his wife from her support systems, discouraging contact with her family, suggesting that her friends were not really friends. Classic patterns of emotional manipulation, all documented." Celeste listened to the evidence being laid out. Each piece fit together with the others. Each piece confirmed what she had been refusing to see for years. She recognized the hotel in the photographs, the peninsula, the one she had suggested for their anniversary trip. Garrett had said it was too expensive for what it was. He had been taking Blythe there monthly. Dorothea had gone pale. Garrett's hands were clenched at his sides. The calculation was still there in his eyes, but it was mixed with something else now, fear. He said, "This is harassment. This is stalking. I will file charges." Harrison spoke. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. He said, "You are welcome to try. My legal team would enjoy the opportunity to depose you under oath." Teddy cleared his throat. He said, "About those divorce papers she signed, there is something Mr. Hollis should know." Everyone turned to look at him. He said, "Given the invalidities in both the prenuptial agreement and the divorce papers themselves, Mrs. Hollis has considerable grounds for appeal. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. In a contested divorce, the discovery process would reveal everything Mr. Webb has documented, and more." He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He said, "You are not divorcing a teaching assistant with nothing, Mr. Hollis. You are divorcing a mercer, with resources to ensure that discovery takes years and costs you everything." Garrett's phone buzzed, then it buzzed again, then it began buzzing continuously, message after message flooding in. His partners, his colleagues, his clients, all of them somehow learning simultaneously that the quiet wife he was discarding was Harrison Mercer's daughter. That was Marcus Webb's work. Discreet, professional, devastating. The doorbell rang. Marcus opened it. A woman stood there, 28 years old, blonde, beautiful, in a carefully constructed way. She was wearing a designer dress and carrying a bottle of wine. Blythe Ashford. She had been called, probably by Garrett, wanting support during what he expected to be his moment of triumph. Instead, she walked into devastation. She looked around the room, at the shattered champagne glass, at the strangers in expensive suits, at Garrett's white face and Dorothea's trembling hands. She said, "What is happening?" Then her eyes found Celeste, found the pregnant belly, found the tear-streaked face, and then her eyes moved to Harrison Mercer. And even though she did not know his face, she knew the energy in the room. She knew she had walked into something much bigger than she expected. She said, "Oh my God, the Mercer heiress. You were married to—" She turned to Garrett. Her voice was sharp with accusation. "You told me she was nobody." Celeste watched Blythe's face. She recognized something there. Not hatred, something worse. The same expression Garrett had when the truth emerged. Calculation, already figuring out how to pivot. Who to blame, how to survive. They were the same, Garrett and Blythe. Maybe that was why they had found each other. The baby shifted inside her. A sudden, sharp movement. Celeste pressed her hand against her belly and felt a pain she had not expected. Not just emotional pain, physical pain. Her first contraction. She sat down slowly, pressed her hand harder against her belly. The room continued its chaos around her. Garrett arguing, Blythe demanding explanations, Dorothea making excuses, Marcus documenting everything. But Celeste went somewhere else, somewhere quiet, somewhere inside herself where none of this could touch her. The second contraction came 6 minutes later. She was only 32 weeks pregnant. The emergency room at Massachusetts General was bright white and humming with controlled chaos. Celeste lay on a gurney while nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency. Monitors beeped. IV lines were connected. Medical terminology was exchanged in rapid-fire bursts she barely understood. Harrison held her hand. This was strange enough to notice even through the fear. Her father had not held her hand since she was a child. He had always shown his love through actions rather than touch. Through trust funds and educational opportunities and the space to make her own choices. But he held her hand now. His grip was firm and warm and steady. A doctor appeared, young, confident. She introduced herself as Dr. Patel and explained what was happening. The contractions were real, but not progressive. Stress-induced, most likely. The baby was not in immediate danger, but Celeste would need to stay overnight for observation. Complete bed rest would be required for the remainder of her pregnancy. Celeste listened, nodded, answered questions when they were asked. But most of her attention was turned inward, focused on the small life inside her, willing her daughter to stay safe, stay put, wait a little longer. The monitors showed a steady heartbeat, 142 beats per minute, strong and regular. Celeste stared at the numbers on the screen. She had never paid much attention to her own heartbeat, but this one mattered more than anything she had ever known. Harrison said quietly, "The baby is going to be fine. The doctors here are excellent. I made some calls." Of course he had made calls. That was what Harrison Mercer did. He made calls and problems got solved and resources appeared where they were needed. Celeste said, "I know, Dad." He squeezed her hand. His voice was rough when he spoke again. He said, "I should have interfered sooner. I saw what was happening. I had reports, but you asked me to stay invisible. You asked me to let you live your own life." She said, "And you did. That was what I wanted." He said, "I could have found a way. I could have warned you without revealing anything. I could have protected you without controlling you." She looked at her father, at the lines on his face that had not been there 5 years ago, at the grief in his eyes that mirrored her own. She said, "You respected my choices. That was the most loving thing you could have done." He said, "Your choices led you here, to a hospital bed, with a husband who betrayed you." She said, "My choices led me here, and I will make better choices going forward." The monitors beeped, the nurses moved, the night deepened outside the window. Harrison stayed. He stayed through the observation period, through the additional tests, through the consultation with the specialist who confirmed that the baby was stable and Celeste was not in active labor. He stayed until 3 in the morning, when she finally told him to go get some rest. And then she was alone. The room was dim. The machines hummed softly. Outside her window, the city lights glittered against the darkness. Celeste lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. She listened to her daughter's heartbeat on the monitor. 138 beats per minute now. The baby was sleeping. She thought about the last 5 years. She thought about the day she decided to hide her identity. It had been her 25th birthday. She had just finished her master's degree. Her father had thrown a party at the estate with 300 guests, most of whom she did not know. They had all wanted something from her: investment opportunities, introductions, access to her father's network. They had smiled at her and complimented her and treated her like a door to be walked through. That was when she decided she would take a teaching job somewhere far from her father's influence. She would rent a small apartment. She would meet people who did not know her last name. She would find out if anyone could love her for herself. And she had found Garrett. Charming Garrett. Ambitious Garrett. Garrett, who had pursued her with such intensity and married her with such apparent joy, and slowly, systematically isolated her from everyone who might have warned her what he really was. She thought about the early months of their relationship, the way he had made her feel seen and understood, the conversations about philosophy and meaning and what they wanted from life. Had any of it been real? Had he loved her even a little? Or had she been nothing more than a project to him from the beginning? A poor girl to be rescued and shaped and eventually discarded. She would never know. That was the hardest part. She would never be able to separate what was genuine from what was performance. The not knowing would haunt her forever. At 3:47 in the morning, she reached for her phone. She opened the browser. She typed, "Signs your husband never loved you." 3 million results. 3 million women, probably, asking the same question in the same darkness. Looking for answers that would not come. Looking for validation that their pain was real. Celeste scrolled through the results. She did not read any of the articles. She just looked at the headlines, the sheer number of them. She was not alone. That was something. She closed the browser and set down her phone. She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby kicked. A soft flutter, almost like a greeting. She said quietly, "I'm still here. We are both still here. Everything else is just noise." She did not sleep, but she rested. She let her body settle into the hospital bed. She let her mind go quiet. And when the sun came up, painting the room in shades of gold and pink, she felt something she had not expected. Relief. The marriage was over. The pretending was done. The worst had happened, and she had survived it. Now all she had to do was figure out what came next. The door opened around 7 in the morning. Nadine walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled like fresh pastries. Nadine Castellanos was 32 years old and had been Celeste's best friend since graduate school. She was the only person besides Harrison who knew the truth about Celeste's identity. She was also the kind of person who showed up at hospitals at 7 in the morning with coffee and croissants. She said, "I brought terrible hospital coffee and excellent gossip. His firm is in chaos. 2 partners are already calling for his removal." Celeste took the coffee. She did not drink it, but she held it in her hands and let the warmth seep into her fingers. She said, "How do you know that?" Nadine said, "I have sources. Also, your father's security chief has been texting me updates all night. That man is terrifyingly efficient." Celeste almost smiled. Almost. Nadine sat down in the chair beside the bed. She looked at her friend with eyes that held no judgment, only love and concern and the kind of fierce loyalty that could not be bought or faked. She said, "How are you really doing?" Celeste thought about the question. She thought about all the ways she could answer it. She could say she was fine. She could say she was handling it. She could put on the brave face she had been wearing for 5 years. Instead, she said, "I survived. My daughter survived. Everything else is just noise." Nadine reached over and squeezed her hand. She said, "You know, I have been biting my tongue for years about him. I wanted to say something so many times, but you seemed happy, and I did not want to be the friend who ruined everything." Celeste said, "You would not have ruined anything. He ruined it all by himself." They sat together in silence for a while. The monitors beeped. The sun climbed higher. The morning shift of nurses came and went, and then another visitor arrived. Someone Celeste had never expected to see. Garrett's first wife stood in the doorway. Her name was Rebecca. She was 41 years old now, with auburn hair and intelligent eyes, and the kind of poise that came from surviving something difficult. She had divorced Garrett 9 years ago, long before Celeste knew he existed. He had told Celeste that Rebecca was crazy, that she had made his life miserable, that the divorce had been a mercy for both of them. Looking at the woman in the doorway, Celeste did not see crazy. She saw someone who had been through something very similar to what Celeste was experiencing now. Rebecca said, "Can I come in?" Celeste nodded. Rebecca walked into the room and sat down in the other chair. She did not speak immediately. She just looked at Celeste with an expression of deep recognition. Then she said, "He told you I was crazy, did he not? That is what he tells everyone, the crazy ex-wife." Celeste said, "Yes, he did." Rebecca nodded. She had expected that answer. She said, "I am not crazy. I am a family court judge in Connecticut. I have documentation of my own experience with Garrett. The same patterns, the same manipulation, the same isolation from friends and family." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder, thin but clearly organized. She said, "I found you because someone should have found me. Before I wasted 3 years believing his version of reality." Celeste took the folder. She did not open it immediately. She just held it in her hands like a weight. She said, "How did you know what was happening?" Rebecca said, "Your father's security chief contacted me. He thought my perspective might be valuable." Marcus Webb, still working, still gathering information, still building a case that Celeste was not sure she wanted. Rebecca leaned forward. Her voice was earnest. She said, "I know you are processing a lot right now, but I want you to know something important. What happened to you is not your fault. The manipulation, the isolation, the way he made you feel like you were never enough. That is a pattern he has used before, a pattern he will use again if someone does not stop him." Celeste listened. She thought about the folder in her hands, thought about what it might contain, thought about the web of manipulation that apparently extended far beyond her own marriage. She said, "What do you want me to do?" Rebecca said, "Nothing you do not want to do. I just wanted you to know that you are not alone, and that the story he told you about me, about himself, about your marriage, none of it was true." Celeste looked at her. This woman who had survived what she was surviving, who had rebuilt her life and become a judge and found a way to move forward, she said, "Thank you for coming, for telling me." Rebecca smiled. It was a tired smile, but a real one. She said, "We survivors have to look out for each other." She stood. She left her card on the bedside table. She walked out without asking for anything in return. Nadine waited until she was gone. Then she said, "Well, that was unexpected." Celeste said, "Yes, it was." She looked down at the folder in her hands. At the evidence of a pattern she was only beginning to understand. She thought, "It was not about me. It was never about me. I was just the latest person to stand in the path of whatever emptiness drives him." The realization was strangely liberating. The failure of her marriage was not her failure. The manipulation was not her weakness. She had simply encountered a person who was very good at a very specific kind of harm, and she had survived. The baby kicked. A strong kick this time, almost like agreement. Celeste looked at Nadine, at the folder, at the morning light streaming through the window. She said, "I think I am going to be okay." Nadine said, "I know you are." 3 days later, Celeste was released from the hospital with strict instructions for bed rest. She did not return to the apartment she had shared with Garrett. Instead, she went to her father's estate, a sprawling property in Weston that she had avoided for 5 years because it reminded her of everything she was trying to escape. Now it felt like sanctuary. Her old room had been maintained exactly as she had left it. The books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, the view of the gardens that had been her playground as a child. Harrison had offered to redecorate. Celeste had declined. There was something comforting about being surrounded by the past, by the version of herself that existed before Garrett, before the hiding and the longing and the slow erosion of her sense of self. Marcus Webb came to see her on the 4th day. He arrived with another folder. This one was thick, heavy with photographs and documents and transcribed conversations. He said, "You should see what we have found before your husband's attorneys try to negotiate." Celeste took the folder. She opened it on the bed beside her. The first document was a timeline. 3 years of Garrett's infidelity laid out in careful chronological order, dates and locations and credit card receipts. The affair with Blythe had started 8 months into their marriage. But there had been others before Blythe, brief encounters, one-night stands, a pattern of betrayal that predated their vows. Celeste studied the timeline. She felt something shift inside her. The last vestiges of doubt disappearing. She had not driven him to this. She had not failed to be enough. He had been doing this all along, from the very beginning. The next section documented Garrett's financial dealings, hidden accounts, transferred assets, a web of deception designed to make himself appear less wealthy than he was. He had been planning for divorce while proposing marriage, protecting his assets while promising her forever. The third section was the hardest to read: emails between Garrett and his mother, text messages, recorded phone calls. Dorothea had been involved from the beginning, not just aware of the affairs, actively facilitating them, finding appropriate women for her son, coaching him on how to keep Celeste compliant and unsuspecting. One message stood out. Dorothea had written it 14 months ago. The message said, "Once she is further along, she will be too tired to fight. We should wait until the 3rd trimester to move forward." They had planned this for over a year, waiting for her to be at her most vulnerable, timing their attack for maximum impact. Celeste closed the folder. She sat very still for a long moment, processing, understanding, accepting. She said, "They treated my pregnancy as a tactical advantage." Marcus said, "Yes, they did." She said, "They saw my daughter as a tool to use against me." Marcus said, "Yes." She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby was quiet now, sleeping, probably, unaware of the ugliness that had surrounded her creation. Celeste said, "What happens now?" Marcus said, "That depends on what you want." With this documentation, your father's attorneys could destroy Garrett completely, every asset seized, every professional connection severed, complete financial annihilation. Celeste thought about it. For one long moment, she imagined it. Garrett losing his partnership, losing his reputation, losing everything he had worked for and schemed for and lied for. The satisfaction would be considerable, but so would the cost, not to Garrett, to herself, to the person she wanted to become. She thought about the last 5 years, the woman she had been, always hiding, always diminishing herself, always making herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. If she destroyed Garrett, she would become like him. She would use her power the way he had used his manipulation. She would win, but at the cost of who she was. Her father appeared in the doorway. He had been listening. He did not pretend otherwise. He said, "Whatever you decide, I will support, but I want you to think carefully about what victory means to Bao." Celeste looked at him, at the concern in his eyes, at the love that had been there all along, even when she was running from it. She said, "I want what I am legally entitled to: child support, fair division of assets, nothing more." Harrison's expression was complicated. Pride and confusion and something like worry, all mixed together. He said, "You are too good for this world, sweetheart," she said. "Maybe. But I would rather be too good than become like him." Marcus Webb nodded. He did not seem surprised by her decision. Perhaps he had expected it. He said, "We will proceed accordingly, but I would recommend keeping the documentation secure in case your husband decides to fight." Celeste said, "He will fight." Marcus said, "Yes, he will." The days that followed were filled with legal meetings and strategic planning. Teddy Vance took over the case. He was methodical and thorough and absolutely unflappable. He explained the options in language Celeste could understand. He answered her questions without condescension. He treated her like a partner rather than a client. The prenuptial agreement was, as he had said, invalid. The divorce papers she had signed were equally problematic. Garrett's attorneys had been sloppy, probably because they assumed she would never have the resources to challenge anything. That assumption was about to cost them. The custody arrangement was the most important piece. Celeste wanted primary custody. She wanted her daughter protected from the manipulation she had experienced. She wanted safeguards in place. Teddy said, "With the documentation we have, supervised visitation is almost certain. Psychological evaluation is standard in cases with evidence of emotional manipulation. Parenting classes can be mandated." Celeste said, "I want him to have a relationship with his daughter, but I want that relationship to be healthy." Teddy nodded. He made a note. He said, "That is a reasonable position. More reasonable than most clients in your situation." Celeste said, "I am not doing this for him. I am doing it for her." She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby kicked in response. Meanwhile, the news had spread. It had spread quickly, as news involving the Mercer name always did. Financial journalists picked up the story. Society pages speculated about the secretive heiress who had been living incognito. Think pieces were written about why wealthy women might choose to hide their identities. Garrett's firm was in damage control mode. Two partners had already resigned rather than be associated with the scandal. Clients were quietly transferring their business elsewhere. The name Garrett Hollis had become toxic in Boston legal circles. None of this was Celeste's doing. She had not given a single interview. She had not made any public statements. She was simply living her life while the consequences of Garrett's choices rippled outward. Blythe Ashford had disappeared. She had ended her relationship with Garrett the same night the truth emerged. She had been seen boarding a flight to Miami. She had not been heard from since. Dorothea Hollis had released a statement expressing concern for her daughter-in-law and grandchild. The statement was so obviously crafted by a public relations firm that several reporters had mocked it openly. And through all of this, Celeste rested. She read books. She watched movies. She let Nadine bring her increasingly ridiculous snacks and spent hours talking about nothing important. She began writing in her journal again, something she had stopped doing during her marriage. She wrote about fear and hope and the strange process of rebuilding herself from the inside out. She did not write about Garrett. She had spent enough of her life thinking about him. He did not deserve any more of her attention. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the hospital, she was sitting on the porch of the estate when her father came out to join her. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn. The gardens stretched out before them in shades of green and gold. The air smelled like earth and coming change. Harrison sat down beside her. He did not speak immediately. He just sat with her, looking at the view he had built with the fortune he had earned. Finally, he said, "I have been thinking about what you asked me once, when you were 18, just before you left for college." Celeste tried to remember. 18 felt like a lifetime ago. Harrison said, "You asked me how I knew your mother loved me for myself and not for the money." She remembered now. It had been the night before she left for Harvard. They had been sitting on the same porch, watching the same view. Harrison said, "I told you I did not know, that there was no way to be certain, that at some point you just have to trust." She said, "I remember." He said, "I was wrong." She looked at him. He said, "I was wrong because I focused on the wrong question. The question is not whether someone loves you despite your circumstances. The question is whether someone helps you become more yourself or less yourself." He paused. His voice was rough when he continued. He said, "Your mother made me more of who I was. She challenged me. She supported me. She told me when I was being foolish and celebrated when I succeeded. I became a better person because she was in my life." He looked at Celeste. He said, "Garrett made you less. I watched it happen." The vibrant young woman who left this house became someone smaller, quieter, more uncertain. He did not love you, sweetheart. He diminished you. Celeste felt tears prick her eyes, not tears of grief, tears of recognition. She said, "I know." Harrison took her hand. He said, "You are still that vibrant young woman. She is still in there. You just have to let her out again." She squeezed his hand. She did not have words for what she was feeling. Gratitude and sorrow and hope all tangled together. They sat on the porch until the sun went down. 3 days later, Garrett arrived at the estate. He wanted to talk. Security let him through because Celeste had agreed to one conversation. She was not sure why she agreed. Maybe she wanted closure. Maybe she wanted to see him one more time before their interactions became entirely legal and formal. Maybe she just wanted to look him in the eye and understand how she had missed so much for so long. He arrived wearing the tie she had bought him for their first anniversary. A deliberate choice, probably. He was carrying flowers, white roses, her favorite. Or at least, he thought they were her favorite. She had actually always preferred peonies, but she had never corrected him. She met him in the library, a formal room, all dark wood and old books. The kind of room designed for difficult conversations. She sat in a wingback chair. He stood near the door, holding his flowers like a shield. He said, "Thank you for seeing me." She said, "You have 10 minutes." His expression flickered. The charm was still there, but it was strained now, fraying at the edges. He walked toward her and extended the flowers. She did not take them. After a moment, he set them on a side table. He said, "I made a terrible mistake. I was stressed. I was not thinking clearly. The pressure at the firm, the pregnancy, everything was happening so fast." He knelt beside her chair, took her hand before she could stop him. He said, "Celeste, we can fix this. We can start over. I know now that I took you for granted. I know I hurt you, but we have history. We have a child coming. That has to mean something." She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the rehearsed apologies, the calculated gestures, the same charm that had worked 3 years ago in that coffee shop, and she saw it for what it was, a tool, a technique, something he deployed when he wanted something. She removed her hand from his. She said, "When did you start sleeping with Blythe?" He blinked. The question caught him off guard. He said, "I... that is not..." She said, "When?" His jaw tightened. He said, "8 months after our wedding." She said, "When did you decide to divorce me?" He said, "I did not decide anything. It was more complicated than that." She said, "When did your mother start planning this?" Each question was delivered calmly. Each answer pulled another thread from his performance. She watched him struggle, watched him try to find the angle, watched him realize there was none. She said, "I do not hate you, Garrett. I do not have the energy, but I will never let you near our daughter with this version of yourself." His expression changed. The charm fell away completely. Underneath it was something uglier, frustration, anger, the face of a man who was not getting what he wanted. He said, "You cannot keep her from me. I have rights." She said, "You have the rights a court decides you have, after reviewing the evidence of your behavior during our marriage." He stood up. His movements were sharp now, aggressive. He said, "This is not who you are. You are not vindictive. You are not cruel. We can figure this out between ourselves." She said, "I thought so too, once. I thought we could figure everything out between ourselves. That is why I never told you who my father was. That is why I tried so hard to make our marriage work. But you were never interested in figuring things out. You were interested in winning." The door to the library opened. Teddy Vance walked in. He was carrying a document. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. He said, "Mr. Hollis, thank you for coming. I have the custody agreement ready for your review." Garrett looked at the document, then at Celeste, then back at the document. He said, "I am not signing anything without my lawyer present." Teddy said, "Of course, you are welcome to have your attorney review the terms. However, I should inform you that we have completed our analysis of the documentation Mrs. Webb compiled." Mrs. Webb. Marcus Webb's wife was apparently the forensic accountant who had been going through Garrett's financial records. Teddy continued, "The hidden accounts total approximately $4.2 million. The diverted assets from your firm partnership are another $1.8 million. Combined with the documentation of emotional manipulation and deliberate isolation, we have more than enough for a very lengthy discovery process." He set the document on the table. Teddy said, "The custody agreement offers you supervised visitation rights, conditional on completing a psychological evaluation and parenting classes. Child support is calculated based on your actual earning potential, not the assets you attempted to hide. In return, Mrs. Hollis agrees to a clean divorce without seeking damages for emotional distress or fraud." Garrett picked up the document. He read it. His face grew redder with each page. He said, "This is extortion." Teddy said, "This is law. Sign it and the divorce is complete within 60 days. Do not sign and face discovery that will take years and cost you everything, including, quite possibly, your ability to practice law." Garrett looked at Celeste. His expression was almost pleading now. The anger had burned out. What was left was something closer to desperation. He said, "Please, after everything we shared, you cannot want this." She thought about what to say. There were so many things she could tell him, about love and betrayal and the slow death of hope, about all the times she had tried to reach him and found no one there. Instead, she said, "Sign the papers, Garrett." He picked up the pen from the table. Teddy's pen, expensive, heavy. She heard the click of the pen in his hand. Click, 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 like a heartbeat counting down. Then the scratch of his signature, page 1, page 2, page 3, Done. He set down the pen. He did not look at her again. He just walked out of the library and out of her life. Teddy collected the signed documents. He said, "I will have these filed by end of business today. The divorce will be finalized within the month." Celeste nodded. She felt strange, empty, maybe, or just tired. She said, "Thank you for everything." Teddy paused at the door. He said, "Mrs. Hollis, for what it is worth, you handled this with more grace than any client I have ever represented. Your father is very proud of you." He left. Celeste sat, alone, in the library. The flowers Garrett had brought were still on the side table. White roses that were not her favorite. She stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the gardens. The leaves were falling now, golden and orange, drifting down like confetti. The end of one season, the beginning of another. She thought, it is over. After 3 years of marriage and 5 years of loving him, and months of suspicion, and days of confrontation, it is finally over. She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby kicked. 2 weeks later, her water broke. The labor lasted 16 hours. Nadine was on one side of the bed. Harrison was on the other. The medical team moved around them with calm efficiency. The pain was extraordinary. Celeste had thought she was prepared. She had read the books. She had taken the classes. She had listened to other women describe what it felt like. Nothing had prepared her. Between contractions, she floated in a strange space. Not quite present, not quite absent, her body doing something ancient and unstoppable while her mind drifted. She thought about her mother, who had died when Celeste was 12, who had never gotten to see her grow up or meet her grandchild. She thought about her father, standing there with tears in his eyes, trying so hard to be strong for her. She thought about Garrett, just briefly, just long enough to feel grateful that he was not here. And then another contraction came, and she stopped thinking entirely. At 11:47 in the evening, Eleanor Grace Mercer was born. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair like her mother. Lungs that worked perfectly, as evidenced by her immediate and vigorous crying. The nurse placed Eleanor on Celeste's chest. She waited to feel overwhelmed, terrified, uncertain, all the things first-time mothers were supposed to feel. Instead, she felt exactly like herself. Finally, completely, she said, quietly, "Hello, sweetheart. I am your mom, and I am going to teach you that love is not something you have to earn." Eleanor stopped crying. She opened her eyes. They were dark and unfocused, the way newborn eyes always are. But Celeste could have sworn she was looking at her. Really looking. Nadine was crying. Harrison was crying. Even the nurses seemed a little misty. Celeste held her daughter and felt something settle into place inside her. Something that had been broken for a long time, finally mending. The hours that followed were a blur of feeding and sleeping and visitors and paperwork. Eleanor was healthy. Perfect. The doctors were impressed with her lung development, given that she had arrived a few weeks early. The stress of the final confrontation had pushed her into the world sooner than expected, but she was ready. Harrison held his granddaughter for the first time with an expression of wonder Celeste had never seen on his face before. He said, "She looks like your mother." Celeste said, "I know." Nadine took approximately 400 photographs. She said it was for posterity. Celeste suspected it was also for social media, but she was too tired to argue. Marcus Webb sent a gift basket that contained, among other things, a onesie that said, "Future CEO." Celeste laughed for the first time in weeks. And in the quiet moments, when everyone had gone and it was just Celeste and Eleanor alone in the hospital room, she finally let herself feel everything. The grief for the marriage she had wanted, the anger at the husband who had betrayed her, the fear of what came next, the joy of this new life in her arms. She did not try to sort through the emotions. She just let them exist. Let them move through her like waves. At some point in the night, a nurse came to check on them. She said, "How are you feeling, Mrs. Hollis?" Celeste looked at her, at this kind stranger who was just doing her job, who had no idea about the complicated tangle of relationships and money and lies that surrounded this particular birth. She said, "Actually, it is Mercer, Celeste Mercer." The nurse nodded and made a note, and just like that, Celeste had her name back. She looked down at Eleanor, at the tiny face that was already the most important thing in her universe. She thought about all the things she wanted to teach this child, about kindness and courage and the importance of being authentic, about recognizing manipulation and walking away from people who diminished you, about love that lifted you up instead of holding you down. She had so much to teach, so much to share, so much time ahead of them. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. 3 months later, Celeste sat on the porch of her new home, not the estate. She had not wanted to stay there. She needed her own space, her own beginning. The house was in Newton, smaller than what she could afford, larger than what she and Garrett had shared. It had a nursery with morning light and a garden that needed work, and a porch that faced west, toward the sunset. Eleanor slept in a bassinet beside her, 3 months old now, growing so fast, learning to smile and grab things and make sounds that were almost but not quite words. The autumn leaves had finished falling. The trees were bare now, their branches making patterns against the gray sky. Winter was coming. Celeste had always loved winter, the quiet, the stillness, the way the world paused to rest before starting again. She thought about the last year, everything she had lost and everything she had gained. She thought about Garrett, signing those papers in her father's library. The last time she had seen him. He had not contacted her since. His attorneys communicated with her attorneys. That was all. She thought about Blythe, vanished to Miami, or wherever else women like her went when their plans fell apart. She thought about Dorothea, still trying to salvage her social reputation after the scandal, still giving interviews about how she had been misunderstood. None of them mattered anymore. They were characters from a story she had finished. She was starting a new chapter now. She looked down at Eleanor, at the peaceful face, the tiny fingers curled against her cheek. She said, "I spent 5 years trying to be invisible, so someone would see me. The logic made sense at 25. At 30, holding you, I understand what I could not then." Eleanor stirred, did not wake, just shifted, settling deeper into sleep. Celeste said, "The people who need you to be less than you are will never be satisfied. You can shrink yourself to nothing, and they will still want someone else. You can give everything you have, and they will still demand more." She touched her daughter's cheek, so soft, so new. She said, "I was enough. I was always enough. He was the one who was not." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, making the bare trees look like sculptures against the light. Celeste sat on her porch and watched the day end and felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: peace. The months that followed were not easy. Celeste had imagined that once the divorce was finalized, everything would magically become simple. She would move on. She would heal. She would rebuild. She had been naive. The healing came in waves. Good days followed by bad days. Moments of strength followed by moments of doubt. Progress that sometimes felt like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. But she was not alone. Nadine was there. Always there, bringing food and bad movies and the kind of honest friendship that did not require pretense. Harrison was there, more present than he had been since her childhood, learning how to be a grandfather, learning how to be a father again. And there were new allies she had not expected. Rebecca came to visit a month after Eleanor was born. She brought a gift basket full of practical baby items and sat with Celeste in the nursery while Eleanor napped. She said, "The first year after my divorce was the hardest thing I ever lived through, but it was also the most important." Celeste said, "How so?" Rebecca said, "Because I finally figured out who I was without him. I had spent 3 years defining myself through his eyes, seeing myself the way he saw me. Once he was gone, I had to look in the mirror and figure out who was actually there." Celeste thought about that, about the version of herself she had been during her marriage. Smaller, quieter, less certain. She said, "What did you find when you looked in the mirror?" Rebecca smiled. She said, "Someone stronger than I expected. Someone who had survived something hard and come out the other side. Someone who had a lot of work to do, but was finally free to do it." She paused. She said, "You will find the same thing when you are ready to look." More allies emerged over the following months. Garrett's former legal assistant reached out. A woman named Mira, who had been fired for refusing to help him hide assets during his first marriage. She had documentation of her own. She wanted Celeste to know she was not alone. A colleague from the firm came forward, a man named David, who had watched Garrett lie to clients for years. He was cooperating with the state bar's investigation. He wanted Celeste to know that someone was finally holding Garrett accountable. The web of manipulation extended far beyond Celeste. It always had. She was just the most recent person to get caught in it. One afternoon, she was organizing the nursery when Marcus Webb arrived for a meeting. He had been coming regularly since the divorce, keeping her informed about the legal proceedings, making sure she knew what was happening. This time he had news, he said. "The state bar has completed its investigation. Garrett Hollis has been disbarred." Celeste paused. She had known this was coming. Teddy had predicted it months ago. But hearing it made it real. She said, "What happens to him now?" Marcus said, "He loses his license to practice law in Massachusetts. The cases he worked on are being reviewed for ethics violations. Several former clients are considering lawsuits." He paused. He said, "His mother is trying to protect him, using her connections. But there is too much documentation. Too many people willing to talk. The pattern is undeniable." Celeste thought about Garrett humped, about the man she had married, the man she had loved, or thought she had loved. She felt something she had not expected, pity, not forgiveness. The wounds were too fresh for that, but pity for a man who had built his whole life on manipulation and deceit, who had never learned how to love or be loved, who would spend the rest of his days reaping the consequences of choices he had made when he thought no one was watching. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Marcus nodded. He said, "There is one more thing. Your father asked me to show you this." He handed her a document, a financial report. She read it slowly. It outlined the foundation she had discussed with Harrison months ago, a nonprofit dedicated to helping children from high-conflict divorces, providing legal resources, and counseling and support. The foundation was now fully funded, ready to launch. She looked up at Marcus. She said, "I thought we were still in the planning phase." He said, "Your father accelerated the timeline. He thought you might need a project." Celeste felt tears prick her eyes, her father, always showing his love through actions, through support that appeared when she needed it most. She said, "Tell him thank you." Marcus said, "I think he would prefer to hear it from you." That evening, Celeste drove to the estate. Her father was in his study, surrounded by papers and screens and the constant hum of a technology empire that never stopped. She knocked on the doorframe. He looked up. His face softened. She said, "The foundation." He said, "Do you like it?" She walked into the study, sat down in the chair across from his desk. The same chair she had sat in as a child when he was teaching her about business and responsibility. She said, "I love it, but you did not have to do this." He said, "I wanted to. You have been through something terrible. I cannot undo it, but I can help you turn it into something meaningful." She thought about the foundation, about the children it would help, about the families it would support. She thought about her own childhood, about the ways her mother's death had shaped her, about the fear that had driven her to hide her identity and seek love in the wrong places. She said, "I want to be involved, not just as a name on the letterhead, really involved." Harrison nodded. He said, "I was hoping you would say that." He pushed a folder across the desk. He said, "Here's the organizational structure. I left the executive director position open. Thought you might want to fill it." Celeste took the folder. She did not open it immediately. She just held it in her hands. She said, "You think I am ready for this?" He said, "I think you have been ready for years. You just needed to believe it yourself." She looked at her father, at the man who had built an empire and raised a daughter and lost a wife and kept going. She said, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." He said, "You are my daughter. There is nothing to thank me for." She drove home that night with the folder on the seat beside her, with the beginning of a new purpose taking shape in her mind. She was not just a survivor anymore. She was becoming something else, something stronger. Eleanor was asleep when she got home. Nadine had been babysitting. She reported that Eleanor had eaten well and played well and only cried once, when she dropped her favorite stuffed elephant. Celeste thanked her friend, paid the babysitter who had been helping, settled into the quiet of her house. She went to Eleanor's room, stood by the crib, watched her daughter sleep. She thought about the future, about the work she would do, about the life she would build. She thought about love, about the kind of love she wanted to teach her daughter, the kind of love she wanted to find for herself. Someday, when she was ready, she thought about the man she had married and the man she had hoped he would be and the distance between those two things. And she understood, finally, that the distance was not her failure. It was his. She had loved fully. She had trusted completely. She had given everything she had. That was not a weakness. That was who she was. And she was not going to apologize for it anymore. 1 year after Eleanor's birth, Celeste's life looked nothing like it had before. She was the executive director of the Mercer Family Foundation. The work was hard and meaningful, and exactly what she needed. Every day she helped families navigate the kind of chaos she had survived. Every day she made a difference. She had finished her novel, the one Garrett said she would probably never finish. It was being published in the spring, not because of her family name, because it was good. She had started dating again, carefully, slowly, with the help of a therapist who was teaching her how to recognize healthy patterns and avoid the old traps. She was happy, not constantly happy, not perfectly happy, but happy in the way that mattered, happy in the way that came from knowing who she was and liking that person. Eleanor was a year old now, walking with the wobbling confidence of a toddler who did not understand that falling was possible. Talking in a language of sounds and gestures that only her mother could fully translate. She was beautiful, fierce, herself in ways that Celeste found endlessly surprising. The birthday party was small, just close friends and family. Nadine, Harrison, Rebecca, who had become a regular presence, a few colleagues from the foundation, the woman who ran the bookstore Eleanor loved to visit. The garden was decorated with streamers. The cake was chocolate, because that was what Eleanor grabbed for whenever she had a choice. The weather was cool but clear. Perfect October afternoon. Celeste watched her daughter toddle around the garden with a handful of adults following behind, ready to catch her if she fell. She thought about the last year, everything that had happened, everything that had changed. A package arrived during the party. One of the staff brought it to her. A wrapped gift, delivered by courier, no return address. She opened it. Inside was a stuffed elephant, identical to the one Eleanor had been carrying when she was born, a replacement for the original, which had been lost in the shuffle of moving. There was a card. It said, "Happy birthday, Eleanor, from your father." Celeste looked at the elephant, at the card, at the careful, familiar handwriting. Garrett. He had not contacted her in almost a year. All communication had been through lawyers. The supervised visitation that the court had ordered had never happened. He had not completed the psychological evaluation. He had not taken the parenting classes. He had simply disappeared from their lives. And now this. She did not know what to feel. Anger, maybe, that he thought a stuffed animal could make up for absence. Sadness, maybe, that Eleanor's father was the kind of man who sent gifts instead of showing up. Or maybe nothing. Maybe she had finally reached the point where his choices no longer affected her. She set the elephant aside. She would decide later what to do with it. Right now, there was a party happening. She walked back to the garden. Eleanor was trying to walk up a small hill, failing, falling, getting back up, trying again. Celeste watched her daughter refuse to give up, again and again, falling and rising, falling and rising. She thought about all the times she had fallen in the last year, all the times she had gotten back up, all the times she had doubted herself and pushed through anyway. She understood finally that falling was not failing. Staying down was failing. And she had no intention of staying down. Not anymore, not ever again. Later that night, after the party was over and the guests had gone and Eleanor was asleep in her crib, Celeste sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The sky was clear, stars visible even through the city light. She thought about the last 2 years. From that moment in the bedroom with the hotel receipt to this moment on the porch with the stars. So much had changed. She had changed. The woman who had hidden her identity because she was afraid of being loved for the wrong reasons. The woman who had shrunk herself to fit someone else's expectations. The woman who had stayed silent while her marriage crumbled around her. That woman was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone who knew her own worth. Someone who spoke up. Someone who fell down and got back up and kept moving forward. She was not the same person who had signed those divorce papers on a November afternoon, and she never would be again. She thought about Garrett, about the stuffed elephant sitting on her counter, about the father Eleanor might never really know. She felt sorry for him, not in a pitying way, in a sad way. He had everything, and he threw it all away because he could not recognize what he had. His loss, not hers. She finished her tea, looked up at the stars one more time, went inside to check on her daughter. Eleanor was sleeping peacefully, one arm thrown over her head, making little sounds in her sleep. Celeste stood by the crib and watched her breathe. She said quietly, "I am going to teach you so many things, how to be strong, how to be kind, how to recognize people who deserve your love and walk away from people who do not." Eleanor stirred, did not wake. Celeste said, "But the most important thing I'm going to teach you is this. You are enough, just as you are. You will always be enough." She touched her daughter's cheek. So soft, so precious. Then she went to bed. And for the first time, in longer than she could remember, she slept deeply, peacefully, without dreams of the past, just dreams of the future. 2 years after Eleanor's birth, Celeste stood at a podium in a conference hall downtown. The room was full. 300 people, had come to hear her speak about the foundation's work, about the families they had helped, about the difference that was being made. She had given speeches before, in boardrooms and classrooms and small gatherings, but never anything like this. She was nervous. Her hands were damp, her heart was racing, but she had learned something important over the last 2 years. The nervousness was not weakness. It was energy. It was her body preparing for something that mattered. She took a breath, looked out at the crowd, found Nadine in the front row, giving her a thumbs up, found her father, sitting quietly in the back, trying not to draw attention. She began. She told them about the foundation, about the children they served, about the legal resources and counseling and support that made a difference in the darkest moments. But then she told them something else, something personal. She told them about her own divorce, about the manipulation and the betrayal, and the moment when she signed papers that ended a marriage she had believed was real. She told them about finding out she was not alone, about the 3 million search results for signs your husband never loved you, about the women asking the same questions in the same darkness. She told them about recovery, about the long, hard, beautiful process of becoming herself again. She said, "I used to think strength meant never falling, never showing weakness, never admitting that something hurt." She paused, let the words settle. She said, "I was wrong. Strength is falling and getting back up. Strength is admitting that you are hurt and choosing to heal. Strength is knowing that you deserved better and finally believing it." She looked at the audience, at the faces looking back at her. Some were crying, some were nodding. Some were just listening, taking it in. She said, "If you are in a situation where someone is making you feel less than you are, if you are with someone who diminishes you instead of lifting you up, if you are lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering whether any of it was ever real." She paused again. She said, "You are not alone, and it is not your fault, and there is a way forward, even when you cannot see it." She finished the speech. The room erupted in applause. Afterward, there was a reception. People came up to her, shook her hand, told her their own stories, thanked her for speaking. One woman approached her near the end of the evening, middle-aged, tired eyes, a wariness in her posture that Celeste recognized. The woman said, "I needed to hear that. What you said. About falling and getting back up." Celeste said, "Are you okay?" The woman said, "I am getting there. It is slow, but I am getting there." Celeste reached out and took her hand. She said, "That is all any of us can do. Keep getting there, one day at a time." The woman nodded, squeezed her hand, walked away with something in her eyes that looked like hope. Celeste watched her go. She thought about all the women like that one, all the women who were fighting their way through something terrible, all the women who needed to know they were not alone. She thought about the work she was doing, the difference it was making, the purpose she had found in her own pain. She thought about Eleanor, waiting at home with the babysitter, 2 years old now, talking in full sentences, asking questions about everything, growing so fast. She thought about the future, about everything that was possible, about the life she was building, and she felt something settle into place inside her. Something final, something true. She was not the woman who had signed those divorce papers anymore. She was not the woman who had hidden herself because she was afraid. She was not the woman who had believed she was not enough. She was something else now. She was someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side. Someone who had lost everything and found herself. Someone who had fallen and gotten back up and kept moving forward. She was Celeste Mercer, mother, advocate, survivor, and she was just getting started. The next morning, she woke to Eleanor climbing into her bed. This had become their ritual. Every morning, Eleanor would wake up before dawn and toddle into Celeste's room and climb up onto the bed and snuggle in beside her. Celeste wrapped her arms around her daughter, felt the small, warm weight against her chest, heard the soft breathing that was already slowing towards sleep again. The sun was just starting to rise, golden light creeping through the curtains, making patterns on the wall. She thought about the speech she had given, about the woman who had needed to hear it, about all the people who might be struggling right now in the same early morning light. She thought about the work still to be done, the families still to help, the difference still to make. She thought about love, about what it meant, about what it required. She had learned so much about love in the last 2 years, about the kind that lifted you up and the kind that held you down, about the difference between someone who wanted you to shine and someone who needed you to stay small. She was not looking for love anymore, not actively, but she was open to it. In a way she had not been before, because she finally understood something important. She did not need someone to complete her. She was already complete. But she could choose to share her life with someone who appreciated that, someone who saw her clearly, someone who loved her for exactly who she was, not despite her strength, because of it. Eleanor stirred, made a small sound, burrowed deeper into her mother's arms. Celeste held her daughter and watched the sunrise and thought about all the beginnings that were still ahead. She thought about the novel being published in the spring, the foundation growing every month, the life she was building with her own 2 hands. She thought about the woman she used to be and the woman she had become, and she understood, finally, what it meant to be free. Not free from difficulty. There would always be difficulty, not free from pain. There would always be pain, but free from the need to be someone she was not. Free from the weight of hiding. Free from the prison of someone else's expectations. She was free to be herself completely, fully, without apology. And that was the greatest gift she had ever received. Eleanor opened her eyes, looked up at her mother with those dark eyes that still reminded Celeste of her own mother. Eleanor said, "Mama?" Celeste said, "Good morning, baby." Eleanor said, "Love you." Celeste felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, happy tears, the kind that came when your heart was too full to contain everything it was feeling. She said, "I love you too, more than anything in the whole world." Eleanor smiled, that crooked little smile that made everything better. And Celeste thought, this is what it was all for. Every hard moment, every painful step, every time I fell and got back up, it was all for this moment, this child, this life. She had been broken, and she had been healed. She had been lost, and she had been found. She had been diminished, and she had reclaimed herself. And now, holding her daughter, in the early morning light, she finally understood the truth. She had always been enough. She had always been worthy of love. And the people who could not see that were the ones who were lacking, not her. Eleanor wriggled out of her arms and scrambled off the bed, ready to start the day, ready for breakfast and playing and all the adventures that awaited. Celeste watched her daughter run out of the room, listened to her footsteps on the stairs, heard the excited babble as she discovered whatever had caught her attention. She lay in bed for one more moment, feeling the sunlight on her face, feeling the peace in her heart. Then she got up, because there was work to be done, a life to be lived, a future to be built, and she was ready. She had been ready for a long time. She just had not known it, but she knew it now, and that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after someone tried to break you? Your story matters. Share it below. And if you want more stories like this, stories that remind you of your strength, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Every like, every comment, every share helps this channel grow and helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are enough. You have always been enough. Closing statement. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. We believe in creating content that not only entertains, but also inspires and empowers our viewers. Thank you for supporting original, handcrafted storytelling.